Cut off and carried up ice by Stewart. Oh my goodness gracious!
The shot block, a shot, scores! Matthew Tkachuk, what a goal!
By the Senators, Cirelli at first, cuts in, scores!
Moves in short-handed, chips it around, Turco and scores! What a goal by Peter Schaefer, short-handed.
If we take a look at the last 5 Stanley Cup rosters, we'll see a common trend. This white line represents the league average for goals scored per game in a season. For example, in 2018, the league average for goals scored per game was 2.78. And as for the eventual championship Capitals roster, they would score on average 3.2 goals per game. 2019, we had St. Louis putting up the lowest average goals scored on this list with 3 goals per game. But they were a defense first team. I mean, they were led by Ryan O'Reilly, who would even win the Frank J. Selke that season. And still, they would have far above the league average in terms of goals scored per game. In 2020 and 2021, the Tampa Bay Lightning would win back-to-back cups, as they would put up 3.5 goals per game in their most efficient season. And finally, this past season, the Colorado Avalanche scored 3.8 goals per game, almost an entire goal more per game than the league average. Yes, defense and goaltending wins championships, but if you can't put pucks in the back of the net, you won't win.
It's Arturi Lehkonen! It's a work of art!
Back in 1909, the National Hockey Association would enter its inaugural season, and it was doing well. It was raw, prehistoric hockey compared to today's game, but it was the Renaissance that led to the game and league structure that we love today. However, in 1914, 5 years after the creation of the NHA, the world would experience an event that would take decades, if not a century, to recover from: World War I. This meant that NHA players were being drafted to the war, which in turn would leave the league in shambles. And as for the owners who were now left with a shell of a team, they were having meltdowns, to the extent the majority of owners would disband from the NHA and they would form the National Hockey League, aka the NHL, as a temporary league so they can remain playing. And as for the negotiations for the NHA, they went nowhere. Thus, they would decide to go forward with the NHL. And in the first season, Montreal Canadiens owned Joe Malone would set a record that still stands to this day, as he would put up 44 goals in 20 games, and he would claim the first ever goal scoring title. And yes, this is an incredible feat, and I'm not taking away from the greatness that was Joe Malone, but it is important to note, the first NHL rosters were still in shambles due to the war. Goaltending, well, they were the founding fathers of the game. That's all I'll say. They were horrible. And in the following decades, nobody would touch Joe Malone's record. In fact, there were several seasons, such as in 1929, where Ace Bailey would win the goal scoring record with 22 goals, half of Malone's 44. Charlie Conacher, distant relative of Corey Conacher, would take home 5 single season titles in a 6-year span. However, back in the day, players had relatively short careers, and Conacher wouldn't touch Joe Malone's single season record, and not until 1945. 27 years after Malone's 44 goal season, we would see a new superstar emerge.
Finest athlete scores his 500th goal. The game is over. The Canadiens win 3-2. Come on,
The puck squirts loose in front. A backhander.
As Maurice the Rocket Richard was the next Canadian prodigy. And in his 3rd season, Richard would do the unthinkable, as he would shatter Joe Malone's original 44 goals, being the first player in NHL history to hit that coveted 50-goal mark. But hold up, we're getting ahead of ourselves, because from 1918 until 1945, here's how the records held up. Joe Malone held the single season goals record, Corey Conacher had the most goal scoring titles, and Neil Stewart led the entire record book with 324 career goals. Yet, these records would be put to shame in the following decades, as Maurice Richard would go on to claim 5 scoring titles on top of claiming the most career goals record in 1953, as he would end up with 544 career goals, which is also why the NHL would name the goal scoring record the Maurice Richard Trophy. Not to mention, Gordie Howe would begin his illustrious career, where he would also win 5 scoring titles, on top of surpassing Richard.
Howe coming up on the right side. Howe over the line to his father. Son to father. Back into they score! Number 9, Father Howe.
Ending his career with 801 career goals. And so at this point, we had a 3-way tie for the most scoring titles record. Maurice Richard would keep his record for the most goals scored in a single season, and Gordie Howe would cement himself as the career scoring champion. And keep in mind, these records up until this point were done with solid wood sticks with a straight blade. That was until 1960. Stick manufacturers would introduce a stick blade made from fiberglass. And this is where shit would pop off, as Bobby Hull and Stan Mikita would experiment, boiling their blades to make a curve. And not only did this allow players to shoot harder from a distance, but the ability to accurately shoot went from 0 to 100, as Bobby Hull would revolutionize the game with his goal-scoring ability. In 1960, he would claim his first Richard Trophy, and in 1966, my God, he would do it.
Getting set, he may pass or shoot, he drives one, score! And the crowd goes wild here in Chicago!
As he would score 54 goals, claiming the record for the most goals scored in a single season. But it doesn't stop there. 3 years after this, Hall would break his own record, scoring 58 goals in 1969. Not to mention he would win 7 Maurice Richard trophies, meaning Hall would also claim the most Richard trophies title. However, Hall would leave the NHL and join the WHA. Thus, his goal scoring records wouldn't change. And at this point, the records were as followed. Bobby Hull with the single season record, Bobby Hull with the most trophies, and Gordie Howe with the most career goals. During the 70s, Phil Esposito would take over the NHL.
Out of Ballarat, screen drive, goal! And that's the record breaker. Phil Esposito has scored 59 goals. The new
Esposito would shatter Hull's single season record, as he would score 76 goals. Nearly 20 goals scored more than Hall's record. And at this point, this record was untouchable. Psych! The emergence of Wayne Gretzky would quickly change the entire trajectory of the NHL. Records that seemed untouchable were now easily achieved, as not only did Gretzky claim the single season record, putting up a mind-blowing 92 goals, 212 points in 80 games. Like what? Excuse me? Bobby Hull's son, Brett Hull, would come close in 1991 with 86 goals, and in 1994, Wayne Gretzky would break Gordie Howe's career goals record, a record that stood for nearly 30 years, as Gretzky would finish his career with 894 career goals. And for some perspective, that is almost 300 more career goals than Phil Esposito, who just so happened to win, 6 straight Maurice Richard trophies. By the mid-1990s, this is where we stood in terms of record holders. Wayne Gretzky with the most single season goals, Wayne Gretzky with the most career goals, and Bobby Hull with the most scoring titles. And now we're in the late 90s, the dead puck era. Scoring was at an all-time low, and all 3 of these records were unreachable. Now there was some great storylines with Yager and Mario Lemieux, Teemu Selanne with 76 goals as a rookie, but nobody would come close.
2004 NHL entry draft, the Washington Capitals are pleased to select Alexander Ovechkin.
In 2004, the Washington Capitals would hit the jackpot, as they would win the first overall pick and select Alex Ovechkin.
play clear. Ovechkin storming in. Alexander Ovechkin curl and drag to the back end. He scores!
In 2008, Ovechkin would put up 65 goals, the highest goal total since Mario Lemieux in 1996. And this was just the beginning. In 2019, Ovechkin would break Bobby Hull's record, claiming his 8th Maurice Richard trophy. 50 years in the making. And so as of today, here are the record holders. Gretzky with a single season record, and Alex Ovechkin with the most titles. But here's the thing, even though Alex Ovechkin is 37, he still has lots of goals to score. And being that he is 20 goals behind Gordie Howe for second place, and 112 goals behind Gretzky, Ovi has the chance to do the impossible and claim the record for the most goals scored in NHL history. I do believe that Gretzky's career total will be surpassed. But there is no way in hell somebody surpasses his single season record of 92 goals. But there's a chance.
By Matthews, here it is, scores! There's a new member of the 60-goal club.
Auston Matthews has cemented himself as the best goal scorer in the NHL. And if it wasn't for missing games, he would have set unprecedented goal scoring numbers in the modern era. As last season, Matthews had 60 goals in 73 games, meaning this man was nearly on pace for 68 goals, a feat that hasn't been achieved in nearly 30 years. So on top of already claiming back-to-back Maurice Richard trophies early on in his career, in a modern game where scoring has been on the rise, Auston Matthews may just be the next player to cement himself as one of the greatest goal scorers to ever play the game. So the question is, who's next?